I knew she'd snap eventually. Karren Delaney, vice president of the Oak Ridge HOA, had been circling my property like a vulture for weeks. First, it was my trash cans being out too early. Then it was the color of my mailbox not being neighborhood standard. She even measured the height of the grass on my lawn with a ruler once. A ruler. But the moment she stepped onto my driveway with a hammer and a can of spray paint, I knew this wasn't just petty harassment anymore. My name's Vaughn Heller. I'm a 38-year-old paramedic who just wanted a quiet place to live after 15-hour shifts and back-to-back trauma calls. I bought this house 3 years ago, before the HOA board got taken over by Karren and her little inner circle of control freaks. Back then, Oak Ridge was peaceful. People waved. Kids rode bikes. Now, you breathe wrong and you get a violation notice. So, 2 months ago, I installed a set of security cameras. Nothing crazy, just 4 mounted cams watching the corners of my house and driveway. I wasn't trying to be paranoid, but when Karren started showing up unannounced and taking pictures of my yard, I decided it was better to be safe than sorry. What she didn't know, and this part is important, is that I also installed 2 microcams. One inside the mailbox post, and another inside a fake birdhouse on the side of the garage. Both motion activated. Both recording in HD. You can thank my cousin, who does AV setups for corporate security firms, for that little trick. It was a Thursday afternoon when it all went down. I'd just gotten home from a double shift, parked my truck, and was halfway up the walkway when I noticed the front camera was gone. Not just turned, but ripped clean off. A jagged bracket was all that remained. I froze. My eyes darted to the side of the house, same thing. The second cam, which pointed toward the garage and driveway, had been smashed in, wires dangling like spaghetti. I took out my phone and pulled up the feed. Nothing. Feed was dead. And that's when I saw her. Karren was standing in the middle of my yard like she owned the place, her signature pastel pink blazer clashing violently with the brown grass she once fined me for not watering enough. Her eyes were locked on the birdhouse camera. I swear, she looked like she was trying to decide if it was watching her. I stepped forward. "Lose something, Karren?" She jumped, then twisted her face into that fake, tight-lipped smile she always used when she was about to lie through her teeth. "Oh, Vaughn, I was just inspecting the front of your home for unapproved modifications. You know, per Section 12, Subclause B of the Community Refinement Guidelines." I glanced toward my smashed cameras. "You mean the ones you just destroyed?" Her eyes flicked in that direction. "I don't know what you're talking about. If your cheap little toys fell, that's hardly the HOA's fault." I was too exhausted for this. "Karren, get off my lawn." She sniffed and turned on her heel. "Expect a notice in the mail." I let her walk off. I didn't say another word. But as soon as I got inside, I sat at my desk, opened up the hidden cam footage, and hit play. There she was. 10 minutes before I arrived home, she marched up the driveway with a claw hammer in one hand and a grocery bag in the other. First, she yanked the front camera off the mount and stuffed it into the bag. Then she stomped over to the side of the house and bashed the second one with the hammer like she was playing whack-a-mole. After both were disabled, she stood in the driveway, hands on hips, looking around to see if anyone was watching. That's when she spotted the birdhouse. She walked over, squinted at it, then pulled out a can of beige spray paint and started coating it. She didn't know the lens sat behind a UV-filtered pane, completely unaffected by paint. I watched the whole thing twice just to be sure. The nerve of her, on my property, destroying my stuff, and then lying to my face like I was some kind of idiot who'd just believe it fell off in the wind. I called Detective Merrigan with the county sheriff's office. I'd worked with him before, brought in overdose victims he later investigated. I trusted him. "Vaughn," he said when he picked up. "What's up? I've got a case of criminal mischief for you. One of my HOA board members just destroyed my surveillance system. He was at my house within the hour. I showed him the footage. I gave him a copy on a flash drive. He didn't say much, just nodded and asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. Then I did something I'd been waiting weeks to do. I sent an email to the rest of the HOA board people who Karren had manipulated but hadn't fully poisoned yet. Attached the footage. Gave them a simple message: thought you should see how your vice president handles community property inspections. The next day, my phone exploded. 3 calls from board members. One from a neighbor who said Karren was going door to door trying to explain the footage. And one very flustered voicemail from Karren herself claiming I doctored the video and that I was harassing her. But the real cherry on top came that evening when a uniformed officer knocked on her door right as I was mowing the front yard. She opened it in a bathrobe, rollers in her hair, and tried to argue. I couldn't hear what was said, but the cuffs were visible from my driveway. She screamed something about how she had authority and that I'd staged it. The officer didn't care. They put her in the cruiser and drove off. I shut the mower off and leaned against it, watching the whole thing unfold. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because the rest of the board had a meeting scheduled that weekend, and I had just been invited to speak. By Saturday, the community clubhouse looked like a courtroom waiting to happen. The HOA's monthly open meeting had been relocated from the usual cramped side office to the main hall, a rare move that meant only one thing: something big was about to go down. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I knew Karren would be late on purpose. That was her move: show up dramatically like some misunderstood monarch returning from exile. The board table sat at the front of the room, flanked by rows of folding chairs. A crowd of about 30 residents had already gathered, whispering in low tones. Some glanced at me, others avoided eye contact entirely. But I noticed something else. 2 of the board members, Curtis and Morella, looked tense. Morella was tapping her pen against a clipboard, and Curtis kept adjusting his glasses like they were fogging up from nerves. Detective Merrigan had warned me that Karren had filed a counter-complaint claiming I had planted the cameras improperly, which, according to her, violated unspecified privacy boundaries. He wasn't worried. Neither was I. My cameras were positioned to monitor only my property lines, and every single one was legally permitted under local ordinance. But Merrigan also mentioned something else. She'd hinted at contacting a lawyer. That meant she was scared. At precisely 12 minutes past the hour, she walked in. No blazer this time. Instead, she wore a deep green dress with shoulder pads that looked like they were borrowed from a 90s soap opera. She carried a thick folder, and her lips were pressed into a line so thin it disappeared into her face. Curtis cleared his throat and tapped the mic. Let's call the meeting to order. We've had a recent incident involving a member of the board and a resident. We've reviewed certain materials submitted by Mr. Heller. Karren cut in. Correction. Allegedly submitted. Nothing has been verified by a third-party evaluator. I believe we are rushing to judgment. Curtis didn't blink. The video was timestamped and reviewed by law enforcement. That's verification enough for the board. I'd like to speak, I said, already walking toward the microphone stand near the front. Karren made a noise like she was choking on her own pride but said nothing. I took the mic. I didn't want to be here today, I began. I work long shifts keeping people alive. I moved here because I thought this was a community that respected boundaries and decency. But over the past few months, that illusion has been chipped away by a pattern of behavior that's gone unchecked. I tapped the tablet I brought. These are stills from the footage, unedited, legally obtained, and backed up in multiple locations. They show a member of this board trespassing onto my property, destroying surveillance equipment, and attempting to conceal her actions. That alone would be enough for concern. But what you don't know is that this wasn't her first time targeting me. I turned the screen toward the board. 3 weeks ago, my mailbox was tampered with. I didn't think much of it then. But the hidden cam caught her lifting the lid and checking the contents when she thought no one was home. The room fell into silence. Morella leaned forward. That's a federal offense. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Karren stood up. This is a vendetta. He's twisting the narrative to distract from his own violations. I have documentation of improper storage of hazardous chemicals in his garage. Paint cans, solvents, materials that could endanger the neighborhood. Are you serious? I asked, turning to her. You're talking about closed containers of spray paint from a home improvement project 2 months ago? You used the same kind to deface my property. Curtis raised his hand. Let's stay on topic. No, Morella said, her voice suddenly firmer than I'd ever heard. Let's talk about the fact that she accessed someone's mailbox. Vaughn, do you have the footage? I nodded. I handed a copy to the sheriff's office. They've already submitted it to the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. That got a reaction. Gasps. A few whispers. Karen's face froze. That's not admissible, she said quietly, but the fight had already left her voice. It's not a trial, Curtis said. It's a board meeting, and your actions have put this entire association at risk of legal exposure. Morella stood. I moved to suspend Vice President Delaney from all HOA activities pending a full investigation. Curtis looked around. Second. A man in the back row raised his hand. Seconded. All in favor? 10 hands went up. Only one opposed. Karren turned, but she wasn't looking at anyone. Her eyes darted toward the door, then back at the table. You can't do this. I've served this community for 8 years. You've used this community, I said. There's a difference. After the vote, Curtis tapped the mic again. While the investigation's ongoing, we'll be reviewing all recent HOA fines issued by Vice President Delaney. If any are found to be fabricated or retaliatory, they'll be rescinded and residents will be refunded. That was news to me. I stepped back from the mic. As I walked past Karren, she didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared straight ahead like her brain was buffering. Outside, a few residents approached me. Not many. Some just nodded. One older man, Mr. Wexler, who lived down the street, clapped me on the back and said, about time someone called her out. But I wasn't celebrating. Later that evening, I got a call from Detective Merrigan. She's lawyered up, he said. Not surprised. But guess what? The U.S. Postal Inspector's Office is opening a case. They're taking it seriously. I sat down on my porch steps, letting the words sink in. She's denying everything, he continued. But we've got her on camera. Multiple angles. It's airtight. If this goes to federal court, she could be facing prison time. I didn't say anything. I just listened. Also, Merrigan added, we found something else while reviewing the footage. On one of her visits to your property different day, it looks like she opened your side gate and walked around the back. My stomach tightened. I never noticed that. It was subtle. But she clearly went in. Didn't take anything, but that's not the point. We might be looking at a pattern of stalking or harassment. I've already passed it along to the DA's office. I thanked him and hung up. That night, I went through the footage again, frame by frame, and he was right. There she was, slipping through the side gate like she had every right. She stayed out of view for about 2 minutes, then reappeared, brushing something off her dress before walking away. I took screenshots, filed a report, documented everything. This wasn't just about cameras or mail or territorial pettiness anymore. This was a full-blown abuse of power. And I wasn't the only victim. The next morning, I got a knock on the door. It was Morella holding a folder. I went through the fine logs, she said. There's a pattern. Karren levied over 30 fines in the last year. 27 of them were issued to people who either didn't vote for her or filed complaints. That's not coincidence. She handed me the folder. You're not the only one she's targeted, but you're the first who fought back. I looked through the names. Some I recognized, others I didn't. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the entire neighborhood. And now that the pattern had been exposed, I wasn't going to stop until every single one of her victims got justice. By Tuesday morning, the mood in Oak Ridge had shifted. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was scrutiny. People were starting to ask questions out loud. Residents who had once kept their heads down were now comparing notes, pulling out old fine slips and taking a hard look at the patterns Morella and I had uncovered. The HOA wasn't just under pressure, it was under a microscope. I'd barely had time to process the growing unrest when a letter arrived from the board's legal counsel. It wasn't a threat or cease and desist, it was an invitation. The board had voted to bring in an independent audit of all HOA disciplinary actions from the past 2 years. They wanted me to sit in as a community representative during the review. That alone told me how far things had already gone. They weren't just covering their backs, they were bracing for fallout. I walked into the audit meeting that Friday in a clean polo and jeans. No uniform, no gear, just a resident standing on equal footing. The audit team consisted of 2 attorneys and a compliance officer from an outside firm. They'd been hired to dig through every violation, fee, and board decision Karren had been involved in. The first thing they brought up was a spreadsheet, one that wasn't part of any official HOA record. This was found in a private folder on the HOA's shared drive, the attorney said, swiveling his laptop toward me and the board members present. It's labeled Priority Watch List. Names, addresses, and handwritten notes. Most of the entries correlate with residents who filed complaints or spoke at meetings. Morella leaned forward. That folder wasn't authorized. We do all official tracking through a third-party management portal. I recognized several names listed. 3 of them had already reached out to me with stories of fines for completely fabricated infractions. But what rattled me was the note next to my name, uncooperative. Possible camera access points. Watch for retaliation. They weren't just keeping tabs. They were strategizing. The compliance officer flipped to the next page in her binder. We also received documents from the sheriff's department. Warranted search of Karren Delaney's home uncovered HOA files stored on a personal laptop. These included photographs of residents' backyards taken through fences and unfiled violation drafts. That explained the side gate incident. She hadn't just been snooping, she'd been compiling a dossier. Curtis shook his head and rubbed his jaw. None of this was ever brought to the board. The attorney didn't look up. That's because she wasn't preparing it for the board. She was acting independently. And illegally. By the end of the meeting, 2 more board members voted to suspend all fines issued under Karren's name pending legal review. Refunds were now on the table. But it didn't stop there. The next day, the county prosecutor's office contacted me. We're preparing formal charges, the investigator said, his voice clipped and precise. Your footage was crucial. But it's what we found on her devices that escalates this. What do you mean? I asked. There's evidence she accessed the HOA's property assessment accounts to alter resident payment statuses. At least 6 residents were marked delinquent, so she could justify lien threats. That was big. Liens weren't just annoying, they were financial weapons. They could destroy someone's credit, block a home sale, or result in property seizure if left unchallenged. She did this without authority? I asked. There's no record of board approval. She used admin credentials from a former treasurer who moved out last year. We believe she guessed the password and never disclosed the access. I stood in silence, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles ached. How many people are affected? I asked. Right now? 12 confirmed. Possibly more. We're opening a fraud investigation. And we'll need you to testify when the time comes. I agreed without hesitation. That weekend, I hosted a backyard meeting for the residents who had been targeted. No formality, no speeches, just lawn chairs, iced tea, and evidence. Morella brought printed records from the management portal showing the discrepancies, and I had my footage queued up on a tablet. People passed it around like a relic. One man, Leon, a retired firefighter, shook his head as he handed it back. She threatened to put a lien on my house last year. Said it was because I didn't pay the stormwater fee. Turns out she made the whole thing up. I paid it on time. Got the receipt right here. He held up a crumpled envelope and Morella nodded. That matches what we found. She marked you unpaid in the system, then filed a lien warning with the board's letterhead but never logged it officially. Another woman, Rachel, was near tears. She fined me for a cracked flower pot, then doubled the fine after I replaced it. I thought I was losing my mind. You weren't, I said. She needed people to feel like they couldn't win. Fear kept her in control. As the sun dipped behind the roofline, the tone of the gathering changed. It wasn't just outrage anymore. It was purpose. We started organizing, planning, not just to clean up the mess she'd made, but to make sure it could never happen again. 2 days later, the sheriff's department executed a second warrant, this time for the HOA's main office. They'd received a tip, and the tipster turned out to be the part-time assistant who'd recently resigned. According to the report, Karren had asked her to shred several envelopes labeled delinquency notices just before the audit began. Inside the office, investigators found a locked filing cabinet with copies of violation letters that had never been mailed. They were pre-signed with board member names but had never been approved. Some were addressed to people who'd never been fined. It was as if she was preparing an arsenal of scare tactics in case residents got too bold. The board held an emergency vote that night. I wasn't just invited, I was nominated. Curtis stood at the front of the clubhouse, his voice steady. We need new leadership. Someone who isn't afraid of transparency. Someone who stood up when it counted. He gestured toward me. I nominate Vaughn Heller for interim president of the Oak Ridge HOA until the next full election. I didn't expect it. Honestly, I wasn't looking for a title. But I saw the faces in the room, people who'd been stepped on for too long. And I knew I couldn't walk away now. I accepted. That night, I stayed up drafting 5 motions. The first abolished the automatic fining system and required a 2-person verification for all future violations. The second created a resident review committee to oversee all HOA disciplinary actions moving forward. The third eliminated retroactive fines entirely. The fourth banned any board member from accessing payment systems without third-party oversight. And the fifth? It required that all board meetings be recorded and archived for public access. By the end of the week, all 5 passed. Karren was officially charged with mail tampering, destruction of property, computer fraud, and falsifying financial records. Her court date was set, and the prosecutor planned to pursue felony charges on at least 3 counts. I didn't see her again after the sheriff took her in. Word was she'd left the county, probably hoping to avoid the public spectacle. But it didn't matter anymore. She'd left a trail too wide to cover. The cameras she destroyed? Replaced. And now we had a neighborhood fund to help others install their own. Transparency wasn't just a buzzword anymore, it was policy. What started with a smashed camera turned into something bigger than I imagined. It exposed a system built on intimidation and lies, and it gave us the tools to rebuild something better. And as I stood on my porch weeks later, watching a group of kids ride their bikes down a street that no longer felt like a trap, I realized something. This place finally felt like home again. The following month moved with the slow burn of a legal fuse inching toward detonation. The board's decision to appoint me as interim president didn't go unnoticed, especially by the firms the HOA had contracted over the years. One by one, I started to receive calls from vendors, landscapers, maintenance crews, even a third-party security consultant. Each one had a story. Each one had been pressured, underpaid, or straight-up stiffed on invoices that Karren had handled personally. It was the security consultant that tipped the scale. His name was Joel, mid-40s, ex-military, the kind of guy who phrased everything like a briefing. He'd been hired 18 months earlier to evaluate the HOA's perimeter lighting and communal surveillance points. But here's the kicker: his final report had been altered before it was filed. He sent me both versions. The original PDF he'd submitted, and the one Karren had uploaded to the HOA's internal archive. The differences were subtle but damning. In his original, Joel recommended installing 3 external cameras along the clubhouse exterior, plus replacing the outdated motion lights in the parking area. In Karren's version, the suggested upgrades were omitted entirely. Instead, there was a paragraph supposedly quoting Joel, stating the current security infrastructure is sufficient and no upgrades are needed. Joel hadn't written that. He even had the email thread to prove it. This isn't just fraud, I told Morella as we pored over the files in the clubhouse conference room. She altered a professional safety recommendation, then lied to the board about it. Morella rubbed her temple, staring at the printed reports. She kept saying the upgrades were too expensive, said the board voted against them. But there was never a vote. She wanted the surveillance week, I said. No cameras, no evidence. It was more than suspicious, it was strategic. And it suddenly made sense why the clubhouse's parking lot had been pitch black for the better part of a year. She deliberately kept surveillance blind for months while quietly consolidating control. I contacted the county prosecutor again. The following week, a joint investigative team from the state's Attorney General's office and the local Financial Crimes Division arrived in Oak Ridge. They weren't just looking at fines and trespassing anymore, they were investigating embezzlement, document falsification, and obstruction of regulatory compliance. As interim president, I was required to give a deposition. They held the interview in a neutral location, a third-floor conference room in a county municipal building. A state investigator named Darnell led the questioning. He had a calm, methodical presence and asked questions with surgical precision. "Can you confirm," he said, "that these documents were not presented to the board prior to recent audits?" "Yes," I said. Karren kept physical control of all HOA records. She claimed it was to streamline efficiency, but the board never approved that. She stopped using the shared portal months ago, and she had sole access to the HOA bank account passwords? She did, until last month. We've since locked her out. Darnell nodded and slid another file toward me. "You're going to want to see this." It was a ledger, not the official one the HOA used, but a handwritten log. It had been found in a fireproof box in Karren's garage alongside personal mail and several USB drives. The entries detailed a second set of books: unreported transactions, unrecorded fee collections, and payouts to contractors who never existed. She created fake vendors? I asked. 3 of them, he said, all registered under shell LLCs, traced back to a P.O. box in a neighboring county and a prepaid phone number. We're building the fraud case now. I sat back in my chair, stunned. How much? Just under $42,000, Darnell said. So far. There was no playing it down anymore. Karren hadn't just abused her authority, she'd weaponized it. Every violation, every fine, every threat, it was all part of a system designed to extract money and silence resistance. When the charges were formally announced 2 weeks later, the town lit up like a fuse had finally reached its payload. Karren was arrested outside a friend's house in a neighboring town. The charges included felony embezzlement, obstruction of justice, tampering with public records, and mail fraud. The news ran with it: local outlets, regional papers. Her mugshot was on the front page of the Sunday edition, right beside a headline that read, "HOA leader indicted amid explosive fraud scandal." But the fallout didn't stop there. With Karren gone, the HOA's insurance provider threatened to drop coverage unless we overhauled internal policies. That meant an emergency vote on new bylaws, mandatory third-party audits every fiscal quarter, and the permanent installation of an oversight committee made up of unpaid residents. It didn't just level the playing field, it burned the whole rigged stadium down. At our next open meeting, the clubhouse was packed. People stood along the walls, some holding copies of the updated bylaws, others just there to watch the final nails go into the coffin. Morella took the floor first. "I won't pretend we didn't miss signs," she said. "We did. But this isn't about blame. It's about rebuilding trust. And that starts today." Then she opened the floor for nominations to fill the remaining board seats. That's when I saw something that stuck with me. Rachel, the woman who'd cried during our backyard meeting weeks earlier, stood up and nominated herself. So did Leon. So did a teenage girl named Bree, whose family had been targeted over a garden shed. People who'd once been afraid of speaking now stood up to lead. I didn't run for re-election. I never intended to stay in the position. My job was to clean house and make room for something better. And I had. After the meeting, I walked out into the cool evening and found Curtis leaning against the railing, sipping from a travel mug. "She's going to prison," he said without turning. "State wants to make an example." "She earned that," I said. He looked over. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't had those backup cameras?" I nodded. "Yeah, I'd be the one under investigation, or still paying fines for things that never happened." He chuckled, the sound dry and knowing. "Funny how one little camera can change everything." "Not funny," I said. "Necessary." The next morning, I took down the birdhouse cam. Not because I didn't need it anymore, but because I didn't want to need it anymore. The neighborhood had changed. People now talked to each other instead of watching from behind curtains. The board was made up of real neighbors, not power-hungry opportunists. And the HOA that once ruled by fear now operated by vote, transparency, and accountability. Karren's trial was scheduled for the fall. The prosecutor expected a plea deal, but made it clear there'd be no leniency on restitution. Every dollar she stole would be tracked, reclaimed, and returned. And me? I went back to 36-hour shifts, trauma calls, and the steady rhythm of saving lives. But this time, when I came home, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't documenting every interaction. I wasn't preparing for war, because the war was over, and we'd won.